Can you believe I'm still having debates about this thing? And instead of just changing it, I've just gotten lazy and I just won't do anything about it. But I don't know. I'll figure something out. Welcome back. Thanks for coming back. Okay, let's get right into this thing. Today, I want to talk about vulnerability. And it's funny because I'm actually amazed that me and Reggie, yes, that Reggie, we never really talked about this before in any of the previous episodes, the 104, 5, however many episodes before this one. So that's kind of surprising. But as I think about it now, it's probably because Reggie would have found some kind of way to blame women for not being vulnerable or blame women for being too vulnerable. One way or another, Reggie would have found a way to blame women for something. I mean, I gotta take a shot. I gotta take a shot at Reggie. It's just too easy. Speaking of which, Reggie, you want to say something to the people, or would you just rather wait to the end of the show? Okay, I guess he'd rather wait. Anyway, vulnerability to me is like a shapeshifter. And if you're not a fan of the show True Blood and you don't know what a shapeshifter is, I, I could go into anyway. The point is that vulnerability can take on so many different forms, which is basically what a shapeshifter is. And oftentimes, the biggest manifestation of vulnerability is when people try to hide their vulnerability or they have a fear of showing their vulnerabilities. But regardless of how they try to hide it or mask it or whatever they do, it's inevitably going to show up in one form or another. And that's, again, talking about shape shifting in a nutshell. People have always said that when you first meet someone, you're meeting their representative. And the reason for that is because neither person has shown their vulnerabilities. Like it's easy to seem like the coolest person in the world when you're not being vulnerable. But when someone eventually does open up and they show their vulnerable side, see, that's when the real rubber meets the road. And that's when you meet the real them and you stop meeting, interacting with the representative. And when you meet someone and you're going through the dating process, there's this game of who'll blink first, who will be the first person to open up in a way that exposes their vulnerable side. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I'm a dude, unfortunately, we as guys, we usually have to put ourselves out there first when it comes to vulnerability, which isn't the easiest thing to do, even though we as men are good at playing it off like it is. Like just saying that you like a woman, which is what we do every time we step to a woman. Actually, when you first step to a woman, you're not really saying that you like her. You're really just saying that you're attracted to her. But even saying that you're attracted to a woman when you step to her is showing a certain amount of vulnerability. And for any women that might question that and think it's too simplistic, I'll ask you all. When was the last time you stepped to a dude that you didn't know and told him that you found him to be attractive? I doubt that. Even if you have done it before, I'm imagining that you probably hadn't done it too often. Well, in this era, online dating, who knows? But that's why I mentioned when's the last time you stepped to a dude, not when you like click the heart on a like or something like that. Actually step into a dude like back in the day. The demographic of this podcast, you all know back in the day when you actually would meet someone, you would approach someone and you would actually talk to them. On a side note, it's funny now when I go places now talking about how hard it is to meet someone out and step to them. When I go places now, like to Walmart or the grocery store, or wherever, it's like you see all of these people, they're on their phone, they have their earbuds in and all of that stuff. They're doing listening to music or whatever they're doing. And I used to think that, boy, society is really becoming more and more closed off, which is true. But the thing about it is, I've actually started doing that now. So, man, it's getting even harder and harder to actually meet someone because when I go to the grocery store now or Walmart or something like that, I'll put in my earbuds and turn on a podcast and kind of block out the world. I don't even forget noticing a woman that's fine or something like that. I don't notice anything or anybody anymore. Boy, wish. Takes us back to online dating. But anyway, going back to the whole thing about telling somebody that they're attractive and how that might expose a certain amount of vulnerability, or how you might have to express a certain amount of vulnerability to do that small thing. Because, and part of the reason for that and what makes it a vulnerability, and the reason that people are hesitant to do that oftentimes and express many vulnerabilities, is simply because you have no idea of what the response will be that will come back at you when you step to someone and tell them that they're attractive. And that's why some people, a lot of people, a lot more than people realize, are hesitant to do it. And I'll admit, while that wasn't the greatest example of someone showing vulnerability, it was an example. And it does speak to the larger point about people's reasons for not showing their vulnerable side. And that point is that, again, we worry too much about the response that'll come back to us. And let me emphasize that point. Everything about being vulnerable is about the response. If people knew that the response to their showing vulnerability would be received in a positive way, everyone would be way more vulnerable. Everybody would be way more open. But because people way too often um, express their vulnerabilities, and because those vulnerabilities are viewed negatively, or there's a fear that those vulnerabilities will be viewed negatively, people are naturally hesitant to be vulnerable. And again, while my early example of stepping to a woman and essentially telling her that she's attractive wasn't the best example, like I said before, what is the best example is when you're faced with telling someone that you're actually in love with them. Forget stepping to them. You're already dating them. You're already together. And the next phase is to tell them that you're in love with them. And people act as though there's some kind of magical moment and you have to be struck by lightning or something before you realize that you're in love. And that's a bunch of BS. It's BS in the same way that chemistry is some BS. And I won't dwell into that. But if you're interested, go back and listen to the chemistry episode that me and Reggie did back in the day. Actually, forget the if you're interested part. Go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already. And even if you have listened to it already, go back and listen to it again. And of course, tell 50 friends to tell 50 friends. But anyway, not to dwell on chemistry, but chemistry is just people being too lazy to really drill down on the reasons that they like someone, you know? And the lack of chemistry is people being too lazy or having an unwillingness to admit what they don't like about a person. The point about chemistry, and I know this isn't a chemistry episode, and I'm kind of straying off the point, but the point is that chemistry is more of an unwillingness to admit something. But while chemistry isn't necessarily about vulnerability, telling someone that you're in love with them or even admitting to it yourself requires some vulnerability. When it comes down to it, whether you want to admit it or not, love is a choice. You don't get struck by lightning. And you can choose love at any time, first date or after the first year, whenever it is. But because of the fear of showing that vulnerable side, see, I'm trying to bring it back together. I kind of strayed off point and now I'm trying to bring it back together. So because of the fear of showing that vulnerable side, instead of choosing to share your feelings with the person that you're in love with and let them know that you're in love with them, you sit on it and you wait to see if you can get signs that they feel the same way. Basically, you're waiting to see if the response will be favorable, if you gone and cop to it. It's like a weird game of chicken. Two people can be in love and not tell each other for sometimes months after they feel it. Think about it. If you tell somebody that you're in love with them and they respond quickly by telling you they're in love with you too, that means that person had already made the choice to be in love with you. They were just sitting on it. Otherwise, you know, otherwise, that's a big decision. You would think if they weren't already sitting on it, somebody says you, I love you, and you'd be like, let me think about that. Do I love you too? No, most times they already made the decision, but they just were waiting for you to say it first. So, yeah, they just didn't tell you first because of the fear of the response. So somebody, going back to that game of chicken, somebody had to take the first step. Yeah. Hmm. You don't hear somebody tell you that they're in love with you, and at that moment you decide, I guess I love you too. Again, like I just said, usually that decision is already made, and you're just waiting for them to be vulnerable. first. It's like I'm saying the same thing over and over again. It's like weird. It's funny how my thoughts are like going today. It's like I had an active day today. Maybe that's what it is. I'm not thinking straight anyway, but I'm clear on this point though. So anyway, those are two examples of vulnerability on opposite extremes. You're telling someone that you're attracted to them, which requires a certain amount of vulnerability, a lesser amount, and then telling someone that you're in love with them, which requires a whole lot more vulnerability, or your willingness to express that. But there are plenty of other examples that fall somewhere in the middle between those two extremes when it comes to dating specifically. And I won't go into all of those, but another one that immediately comes to mind is even during like when you're, excuse me, in the getting to know you phase of dating, when you want to hear from the person that you're dating, but you don't call. Because if you're a woman, you don't want to seem like you're thirsty by calling a man, and you don't feel like traditionally you should have to call a man, even though you desperately want to talk to the dude. Or if you're a guy, you already called her twice today, and you don't want to seem like you're being thirsty if you want to call her a third time, because that'll make you seem thirsty, like I just said, and you already talked to her twice. And yeah, again, it comes down to the fear of the response. Or when you don't like the fact that someone has done something to you repeatedly that you don't like, and instead of telling them that you don't like it, you play that little game or whatever. Like, if he didn't call me, then instead of asking him why he didn't call me or expressing to him that you need more consistent communication, you just don't answer the phone when he eventually does call, even though you really want to talk to him. And then you make him wait. And then you make him wait and call him back 3 days later to kind of teach him a lesson or whatever. You do that stuff and you play those games because you don't want to show vulnerability by telling dude in this example how you feel about his inconsistency. So again, there's the fear of the response to that showing of vulnerability. And there are tons of other examples, but I think you get the point. Like I said, I wasn't going to go through them all, but I do have a lot more in my head. But out of the interest of time, and yeah, I just don't really care to go through all of those. Email me. Uh, what is the email address? Michael@datingwhileadulting.com. Yep. So I know the buzzword for these days in dating is communication, but I feel like a person's willingness to not only show vulnerability, but the willingness to show it sooner rather than later is way more important than communication. If you can't be vulnerable, there's no way that you'll be able to communicate anything in any kind of depth. It's kind of ask backward to tell someone that they need to communicate, and that communication is the key, but you give them a pass on being vulnerable. It's like asking someone to make an omelet without eggs. And it applies to both genders. I hear women complain all the time about men's failures to communicate. And part of that is because men aren't often in tune with their vulnerabilities. Too many of us guys don't even acknowledge vulnerabilities. And women may talk a lot about that is talk about might and women might talk a lot is what I'm trying to say, but that isn't necessarily communication. I mean, I hear women talk about having a wall up or having their guard up, which to me is an excuse to delay showing their vulnerability. But how can you be an effective communicator if you're not vulnerable? It really is like a chicken and egg situation. So in closing, and yeah, this is a quick one. The last one was pretty quick. The last one was like 18, 19 minutes. Yeah. Anyway, and this one, I guess, will fall in line with that. So in closing, let's stop with all this mess about communication, because it started off about vulnerability and it's about vulnerability, but I'm knocking communication at while I'm going through it. Let's talk more about being vulnerable and being willing to show that vulnerability regardless of the response. I think that's the most important thing. The best communication is born out of vulnerability. And so there's a part of it that I didn't mention and I didn't talk about, because it's one thing for people to be vulnerable and everybody should open up and be more willing to be more vulnerable. But on the other end, the person that you're being vulnerable to, they need to be in the place where they are accepting of your vulnerability and not rejecting that vulnerability. Because what it comes down to ultimately, if you're opening up to someone and you're being vulnerable with someone and you don't get a favorable response to your being vulnerable, that's probably not the person that you need to be with. So it's almost like trying to force something to happen that shouldn't happen, trying to make something out of something that shouldn't be made into something. So instead of being concerned about the response, you should look forward to the response to your vulnerability, because that will tell you faster whether that person is for you or not. Because if somebody laughs at you, or if they dismiss you, or if they're just on a different plane from you when it comes to your expressing your vulnerability, that tells you a lot. I mean, going back to the love thing, if you tell somebody that you're in love with them and they respond with, that's nice, or they respond with, aw, or something like that, if they respond with something other than, I love you too, that one lets you know where you stand with that person, even though it'll hurt a little bit, because if you express that and they don't respond in kind, yeah, it'll suck. But you know where you stand with that person, and that can lead to deeper conversations about, okay, what might be lacking in the relationship, if there's anything lacking in the relationship, and it will empower you with what you need to know to make a decision as to whether you should be with that person or not. And this isn't about staying in relationships too long. I might have an episode about that. But just on a side note, yeah, we need to kind of like do true evaluations of these relationships and exit them if we need to, without fear of being lonely, or, well, they're good in these areas, even though you're brokenhearted in these other areas. Yeah, we all need to be fulfilled in relationships. And yeah, and showing that vulnerability as quickly as possible is a good way. I am a person that is very intentional in my feelings, and I let people know how I feel about them. And yeah, I also have no problem stepping away from situations when they're not fulfilling for me. So yeah, at least being single a lot at this age, but I ultimately believe that it leads to a happier life in the long run. Because I tell you what, I have been lonely in relationships before. Having a piece of somebody, ugh, nah, that's not the move. But now I feel like I'm like going into the area of lecturing, so I'll stop now. I said in closing like 5 minutes ago. I mean, yeah, I said in closing like 5 minutes ago, and I'm still talking. So Reggie, say goodbye to the people. Reggie. Reggie doesn't want to say anything. Reggie's so tough. Reggie's so difficult. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I love you all, even though I don't know you all. I'm just feeling very loving today. And that's me being intentional. I love you, or you. Yeah, you. Yeah. So we need more love in this world. Um, you all see the story about that Miss America, or whatever she was, woman that was 30 years old, that jumped off the balcony of her apartment? Whew. Life, man. That's what my mother used to say. It'll kill you. All right. God bless. All right. I'm done here. Goodbye.